On today's show, are the Capitals going to go into next season with the roster as is? Or is this just the silence before the storm?
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the past 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minutecast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk quite a bit about some young players on this team that are fighting for roster spots. We're talking about Miroshnichenko. We're talking about Andrew Cristall. But a player that seems to have been lost in the shuffle is Ethen Frank. Is he the wild card? I'll talk about that a bit later. We'll talk about Lynden Lakovic, World Junior Summer Showcase. This is going to be very exciting as a Capitals fan or just a hockey fan in general, as you will get to see Lynden Lakovic on the big stage. But just to get it going here, is this just the silence before the storm? Now, if you are an everydayer of the show, you know I've talked about how I think it appears that the Capitals are going to be leaning into the youth a little bit more than we've seen in seasons past. And I say that because the Capitals went out and they were all in on Ehlers, not to mention some other players that have been in the mix, but they kind of struck out so far. Or that's what it appears. Are the Capitals fine to go into the 2025-26 season as is, or does Chris Patrick have a big move or two up his sleeve? Now, it's interesting that, the big melee was on July 1st, right? That is free agency. And when there was a lot of players on the move, and the whole time, I think as a Capitals fan, you're like, okay, this player went there, and this player went to that team. Okay, any moment now, Capitals make a big move, and well, it didn't happen. And to be clear here, I am fine going into next season as is, but I was still a little bummed out, I guess you could say, that the Capitals did not go out and make a big acquisition. And is that what is going to be the case? Or, like I said, does Chris Patrick have a bigger move or two or more up his sleeve? Let's dive into that in segment 1 here. And like I said, it's July, and it's been crickets since July 1st. And, that's to be expected. I think that a lot of the GMs are taking this time and a lot of the team staffs to relax, as the hockey season is a busy season. So I think a lot of them are at their cabins or cottages, depending on where you live, what you want to call it, and a good time to relax before the hockey season kicks in. But for the teams that didn't go out and acquire the big fish that they had hoped for, in this case, I'm talking about the Capitals, you got to think that Chris Patrick and maybe Brian McClellan are still working the phone, trying to pull off a big move. Now, I know the story we've been told. It's similar to the story that I've told you, that the Capitals, and me for that matter, are fine with this team going into the 25-26 season. I say fine, right? I think that obviously it would be better if they did make a bigger move, as long as they can do it and not mortgage the farm and not spend a whole lot of money. That you saw the Capitals last season. They made it to the playoffs, first team to clinch a spot, made it to the second round, but still got fanned out in the second round. So obviously not enough. And to put all of your eggs in the youth basket is a nice idea, but it is also prone to being a bit risky, as sometimes these young players don't perform well, maybe the way that you hope. Now, to be clear here, there are still the veterans. You still got Ovechkin and Wilson and Carlson and these kind of guys. But I think they still need an elite goal scorer, right? I think that, when you take a look at the teams that played well, I'm going to talk about the Panthers and the big moves that they made. I mean, talk about how big of a difference it was for Brad Marchand to join the Panthers. Some people are like, wow, that's kind of an interesting move for the Panthers to make. Paid off big. And it wasn't just Brad Marchand that won, but those kind of big moves, those ostentatious type of moves, are oftentimes the moves that really can catapult your team over the top. So I think the Capitals should make a bigger move or two. And according to hockey insider John Shannon, don't sleep on August, as oftentimes August is the slowest month. As like I say, a lot of the GMs, a lot of the staff of around the team, ownership, etc., they go to their cabins, they spend time with their family, and they show up later in August, early September for camp, to give themselves 2-3 weeks, whatever the case might be, to rest up, refuel, and to get ready for the long hockey season. But Shannon told 880 CHED Up in Edmonton that he, quote, still thinks there's a bump of trades coming, unquote. And I kind of believe him, right? He even mentioned a second wave of free agent signing could hit. And I'm going to keep it to the Capitals here, as the Capitals were all in on Ehlers. They sniffed around on Jack Roslovic a little bit, and Jack Roslovic, as I record this, is still well up for the taking. Now, should the Capitals pursue Jack Roslovic? I'll talk about his numbers in a little bit here. Good upside. The question, however, is something I've posed on this podcast quite often. Why is it always the need, the feeling to go out and acquire a player like Jack Roslovic when maybe you have that same option, if not better, internally? Is it covering all your bases in case one of the young guys doesn't work out? Yeah, probably. And, when you take a look at Roslovic, I'll keep it to him in particular here right now, that I think that if you take a look at the back of his hockey card, even though it's not impeccable, shall we say, that there is some pretty good upside. And as far as Shannon is concerned, he name dropped a couple of players that stood out: Jack Roslovic and Victor Olofsson. Two big names. And those are two guys that are still sitting out there. And the Caps, well, the Caps are still lurking. I think they're still kicking the tires. And honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised, despite what these insiders, Jeff Merrick and Elliot Friedman and John Shannon, these kind of guys, that the Capitals should be the front runners to make a big move, as they lost out, on the Nikolai Ehlers sweepstakes. And as a quote-unquote insider like those guys are, I can see where they can, draw that conclusion. However, I think that if the Capitals wanted to acquire Jack Roslovic, they would have done it. I think that they're still thinking about it. Maybe there's some other moves that these insiders haven't considered. And also, I don't want to be dismissive of what Chris Patrick said. And, what I've said as well is that I don't think this team is afraid of going into next season, with young guys. I really, really don't. Elliot Friedman mentioned earlier this month that Washington took, quote unquote, a long look at Roslovic when free agency opened. Roslovic had 39 points last season, 22 goals, and he plays both center and wing. Why is that advantageous? Well, you ask. Well, Connor McMichael. Oh, yes, good old Connor McMichael. Is this going to be his season for the third line center position? That would be an ideal fit, right? But if not, he could always just take on his role that he had last year on the second line left wing. How that becomes intriguing and interesting as insert Jack Roslovic, who is another player that can also play wing and center, seems like a perfect fit. And if you are an everydayer of the show, I spoke about this in, June, about Jack Roslovic maybe being the perfect fit. And what is said about him? Versatile, quick, decent offensive instincts, but he was also scratched a few times in the playoffs by Carolina. And that stinks to me. Why? I would like to pry into that a little bit. Was it based on performance? Was it based on Brind'Amour didn't like something? What about it did he not like? I've had quite a bit of questions, candidly, teams are like, well, what do you think? What's your take on Kuznetsov? Would he be a good fit there? And is he a good guy? I'll be pretty honest with you. And, that's a good question to ask the Carolina Hurricanes. What was it? The numbers weren't shining. And, you take a look at it. I think that they just think that they had a better option. And when you're in the playoffs, you're pushing all your chips in. But just given the fact that, he was scratched a few times in the playoffs, does, kind of, put that on my radar, something to consider. A flag goes up, if you will. So there is some risk there too. Honestly, he could be the type of depth scoring piece Chris Patrick hinted back all the way in May. Remember when he said they wanted to add a quote, a skilled player, unquote, still waiting on that big swing. And, it's my take on it that Chris Patrick probably wants to feel like he's capable of pulling off a big swing, or maybe that is just me projecting my feelings onto him. But, when you swing and miss on a guy like Nikolai Ehlers, and then you see a competitor, a team that you faced in the playoffs, I'm talking about you, Carolina Hurricanes, that's got to sting. And that's got to sting quite a bit. So you got to think that he wants to go out and take a big swing. Is Roslovic that kind of swing? Now, right now, they've only got 10 of their 12 regular season playoff forwards returning. The Capitals have cap space, just over $4 million, and no major contracts left to sign, except for LaPierre, who signed the bridge deal. So all the boxes are checked for the most part. And the feeling was on Ehlers was that Anthony Beauvillier was, well, I guess, come on over here, Anthony Beauvillier. I asked the person I wanted to dance, and they didn't want to dance. And I know I talked to you, just get over here, let's dance. So that is why Anthony Beauvillier is here. And, I say that, a little bit in jest, but you got to think that the Capitals would have liked to have Ehlers, for example, over Anthony Beauvillier. But it's the position that they're in. It's not a horrible position. This team built as is still a really great team. And you take a look at the subtractions, Mangiapane, Radish, Alexiev, these kind of guys. We're talking Hunter Shepard and some of these depth pieces, not big contributors. So I'm not too concerned. Now, if, a big name piece moved, say it was a big prospect or a player that's on the active roster, then I'd be concerned. But the players that left had medium to little impact on this team. So I'm not too concerned. But I'd say don't rule out the Capitals being involved if Roslovic price drops or if a team needs to shed salary and Patrick wants to pounce. So, I think there's a lot of balls in there, and you got to think that in Roslovic's case that there's probably quite a few teams that are sniffing around. Someone's got to pull the trigger here sooner than later. Will it be the Capitals, and are they just doing that? And ultimately, is that the right move? I like his numbers. I'm cautious about what I saw in the postseason. Put that all together, I would be okay if the Capitals signed him, and I would also be okay if they chose not to. A lot to consider for Chris Patrick before the puck drops this fall. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about Lynden Lakovic, World Junior Summer Showcase, and Andrew Cristall getting in some work. There's a lot to dig into straight ahead. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little bit more thrilling with FanDuel? You can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburnt at the beach. Now, listen, the Nationals aren't having the season that they're looking for. It's this rebuild that's going to happen at some point. And the Baltimore Orioles, those are two regional teams that maybe you're interested in, but maybe you want vested interest in all of the games. Open up the FanDuel app, put a little bit of money on the game. All of a sudden, they got that much more exciting. Now, me personally, I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast ways to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. And are you new to FanDuel? New customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me over on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in segment 2 here, we're talking about the youth in this organization. Lynden Lakovic being added to the World Junior Summer Showcase representing Canada. Cole Hutson, there's talk there, and Andrew Cristall is ramping up for next season. A lot to be excited about. Are you guys excited about hockey like I am in July? Let's dive into that in segment number 2. There is so much to get to talking about the Capitals, your favorite team and mine, and Lynden Lakovic. Man, the Caps first rounder is heading to Team Canada. A late invite, but, like they say, better late than never, and that's a big deal. That is the player the Capitals selected here this summer, and some pretty good upside, I think, is going to be a big piece of the Capitals' future. And when I say big, literally 6'4", big guy, and puts up big numbers, 58 points in 47 games last year with Moose Jaw. Now, he is not going to be joining the Capitals in the fall, but it's one of those things that you have to be patient with, the understanding that when you just take a look, and I'll talk about some of the players about the future, this team is going to be absolutely stacked in the future. And what are some of the things I like about his game? When I'm talking Lakovic here, is his size, good skater, good release, and he was named the captain of the Moose Jaw team on a team that, all things considered, was pretty poor. He was the cream that rose to the top. And, like I say, a lot to like about him. Big body, wicked shot, and a sneaky good playmaker. He's not just a finisher. Again, he was the player that was selected 27th overall in the first round for a reason. Maybe not a player that you had circled, maybe not a name that you were super familiar with, but when you take a look into him, and if you're an everydayer of the show, I spoke and I broke down what kind of player he is, going to be a game changer for the Capitals. And he will face off against Team USA, Sweden, and Finland from July 25th to August 2nd in Minneapolis. Now, you're going to want to watch those games if you can. I don't know where they're broadcasting it right now. I have not looked into that aspect of it right yet. But if you can find a way to watch it, what an excellent opportunity to see what this guy has in the tank, playing against some of the best at his level. And I think you'll be impressed. I've watched quite a bit of highlights footage of him, quite a dynamic player. And again, I'm not just pumping your tires here because I'm a Capitals fan and he's a Capitals player. Going to be a game changer. Also repping the Caps is defenseman Cole Hutson. Another guy, maybe you've heard of his brother, Lane Hutson. One heck of a hockey player, a guy that is an honest assessor of himself, said, I have some work to put in before I'm ready to go. Exciting. And also Nicholas Kempf for the U.S. Hutson, a good puck mover, 48 points at BU last season. Dynamic. Going to be great. Should be fun to see him quarterback that PP. Now, Kempf, was a bit of a rough freshman year at Notre Dame, just 2 wins, sub 900 save percentage, but this is a good chance to reset. And I think the Capitals are still hot on him. He is considered to be, one of the big pieces in the future between the pipes as well. So exciting, Capitals, future stars, Hutson, Kempf, Lakovic. A lot to be excited about. Young talent. And I think that, getting a look at this talent, you can kind of get a bit of a peek into the future. Because I think a lot of us are still caught up on Alex Ovechkin. And if it's going to be his last season, that you can kind of rest assured that, if it in fact is his last season, which I do believe it is, but if it is his last season, that the next wave and the subsequent waves that follow are going to revolutionize, even make this a better Capitals team with Alex Ovechkin on it, if you can believe it. I do believe it. And Andrew Cristall, a guy that is going to be fighting yet again for a roster spot. I have my opinions. I think there is the distinct possibility that if Connor McMichael gets that third line center position, that Andrew Cristall could be that second line left wing. Now, it's really early, and I've heard a lot of the different beat writers, for the Capitals, and so kind of a lot of them think that he'll start the season in Hershey. Now, listen, I think he's going to battle, and I think he could prove a lot of people wrong, even some of the beat writers. I think there is the distinct possibility that he starts the regular season. It could be anywhere, but let's pencil him in right now in pencil with a big eraser on there. Things are subject to change on that second line left wing. Let's get a good look at that. Some good upside there. What is he going to look like under the big lights during the regular season? A lot to be excited about. And right now he's back in British Columbia alongside Connor Bedard. Yeah, that Connor Bedard, not a bad summer skate group to work with. If you're not aware, and I got to think you got to know Connor Bedard, a dynamic generational talent. We'll consider him at some point. And if some of that can rub off on Connor Bedard, or on Andrew Cristall, then even better. Now, they've known each other since they were 6, roller hockey, spring league, you name it. Bedard even called Cristall probably the smartest hockey player he's ever played with. Connor Bedard said that about Andrew Cristall. Let's get excited. Andrew Cristall, and that's not just, speaking, out of turn. That's just not pumping the tires on Cristall because they go way back. I believe it. And, there were things that he needed to work on. That's why Andrew Cristall wasn't drafted higher than he was. He's worked on that. He's bulked up. He's worked on his skating. And he can't get taller. He can't control that. But he's done the things that he needs to do to get better. And if you question what he's made of, and I understand this is at the junior level, so it's not an apples for apples comparison, but Cristall absolutely torched the WHL last season, 132 points, won the Bob Clark Trophy, then added 41 more in the playoffs. Clutch. It's going to be huge. And, you take in all this conversation is Ryan Leonard, who is full go on the Capitals right now. Again, can we drop the puck already? I'm just so excited. Now, the guy was nearly NHL ready last fall, if we can remember, one of the last cuts from the training camp. If he comes in hot again, which I think he's going to even come in hotter, if you can believe it, it is going to be really hard for the Capitals, Spencer Carberry, the decision makers, to send him back down. Now, the better position this year is he doesn't have to go back to juniors. He's not. If it doesn't work, he can go to Hershey, which is the hockey crock pot for the Capitals. Some great talent. Hershey, you're also going to want to watch. There's a lot of hockey to watch during the regular season with the Capitals, but also if you can't make it to the games in Hershey, there's different ways to watch it online. I think Hershey, the battle in net, there's a lot of exciting storylines to follow within the Capitals organization, a lot to be excited about. And Chris Patrick is pretty pumped about him as well. He said, quote, if he has a camp like last year, it's going to be hard to keep him off the roster, unquote. That's a pretty loud message. And all he's got to do is do what he did last year and improve on that. Check the boxes. Don't think about it too much. Just go out there and play Andrew Cristall hockey, and good things will happen. I'm a skeptic. If you've watched the show, sometimes I'm a bit skeptical on how things go. I'm not so skeptical on him. I'm really kind of bought and sold on Andrew Cristall that this is going to be his year. And I've done this before. I've talked about Connor McMichael, and it had to be his year. And guess what? It was his year. That sometimes you can tell, when you take a look back on it, I think there was a lot of people that were bummed, and myself included, that Cristall didn't make the team. But when you realize that he just went back to juniors, Kelowna, and then out to Spokane, he just got better. And maybe he wouldn't have got better, if he was on the Capitals, as an extra up in the box. And, I hear the different people on YouTube. I hear all of you on everyone out there. I hear your comments. I read your comments that maybe he learned some bad habits, and maybe he did. But they weren't glaringly apparent. And I think that he is of a good enough hockey mind that he can, learn to erase those bad habits that maybe he learned. Again, I hear quite a bit of chatter on that maybe he would have been better to stay on the big team. But again, that's my take on it. Someone that does this show is that I hear what you're saying. However, I think that he was better off playing in junior, since playing in Hershey wasn't an option at that point. that he could work on his game, get in a lot of minutes, and absolutely crushed it. There was a lot to be excited about, and a lot to be excited about him going into next season. All right, so coming up here after the break, the wild card. Ethen Frank, he's a guy that's got lost in a lot of this. We hear about Miro, we hear about Cristall, we hear about a lot of different players in the mix, but Ethen Frank's like, hey guys, what about me? I'll give you your flowers straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. So in the final segment of the show here, we're talking Ethen Frank. And when I said flowers, what I meant is his congratulations and just to shed some light on a guy that I think got kind of lost in the mix. We take a look at the tail end of the season. At the trade deadline, the Capitals brought in Anthony Beauvillier, and this player bounced around. And, well, next thing you know, Ethen Frank is out of the mix, but don't count him out. And, is he heading up to make or break? You know what I mean? Is that the point of his career right now with the Capitals, is make or break? Kind of. Because, you take a look at him. He's the fastest skater in the AHL, had that record, and, put up some big points, but you got to sustain. And at some point you need to take that big jump up to the big team. Otherwise you kind of just miss out on everything. See Pierre Dubé, for example. The Capitals, myself included, were very in on Pierre Dubé. Like, this guy is going to be a dynamic goal scorer. Had a small cup of coffee with the Capitals and didn't exactly kill it. And that's what you have to do. The pressure is tremendous. When you're given your opportunity, you need to kill it. And, Pierre Dubé didn't do that. And subsequently, not a Capital anymore, not a Bear anymore. So let's bring this to Ethen Frank, another guy that is in somewhat, in my opinion, in a similar position that, make or break might be a little bit strong, but he's kind of getting there. That in this camp, he needs to prove that. Take a look around, Ethen Frank. There's, Miro here, there's, in the next wave, there's Lakovic, there's Leonard, there's Cristall, there's all these guys. These guys all want a spot on the active roster, and so do you. Now, the stats where they're drafted, and, those are bigger marquee names. What are you going to do to differentiate yourself, to say, I see the talent there, that they, maybe have a better pedigree, a better skill set, but I can still bring it. He's going to need to do that this fall if he's going to want to stand out in a busy camp and a lot of players that in a lot of ways are better than him. How is he going to stand out? Speed is one thing, but he's going to need a whole lot more than that. So let's close out with a spotlight on Ethen Frank. Now, when we take a look back on Frank, quietly had himself a nice little NHL debut last season, scored 4 goals, 3 assists in 24 games, and looked honestly NHL ready, at least at first. Came out of the game really hot, and I thought to myself, yeah, the wait was worth it. And before that, 20 goals in 35 games with Hershey. Dude was lighting it up before the call-up. And honestly, why he got the call-up, because, there was a cry out there, a hunger, myself included, that we need to see this guy under the big lights for the Capitals, and he did not disappoint. Now, the thing is, Frank is now 27, and this season is kind of, like I said, we're entering into somewhat of a make or break. Is he just a nice call-up, or can he be an every night guy? And, it's to the point where if he's not good enough, do they send him to Hershey? Is he the healthy scratch for the team, the extra? I don't want it to come to that for him. I think there's a lot of raw potential, but we're going to need to see more. Like I said, it's going to be a battle royale in camp. Now, the good news is his skating, his shot, his offensive instincts, I'm going to say they're NHL caliber. He just needs to show consistency. Isn't that the common theme? Who else needs to show consistency? LaPierre. Consistency is something that is not an easy thing to do. Go out there and be consistent. Just go out and do it. Easier said than done. But a lot of these young players, that's what they lack. Connor McMichael, even when he first called up, was inconsistent. Glimpses of greatness. Hendrik LaPierre, glimpses of greatness. You need to bring it each and every night. You can't be good one game and then, cold 3-4 games after that. You need to be consistent night after night. If Spencer Carberry puts you in the game, he gives you the sweater, says, go out there, you got to execute. Because like I said, it's a logjam. There is a lot of players that want to be in the mix. And the competition, like I said, is tough. Sort of now. Sonny Milano, another guy in the mix. Even Mirshnashenko fighting a spot. Cristall pushing. LaPierre. There is a lot of guys fighting for maybe 3 spots. How are you going to differentiate? How are you going to stand out? It's not going to be easy. I think he can do it. I think. A lot of that is up to him. I think the skill set's there. The speed. That's one of the things that, differentiates him. But it's not just speed enough. You got to have a great shot. And he does have good hockey instincts, but he needs to bring it. And I think Frank makes the team out of camp. I do. But is it sustainable? That's the hard part. Because, when you take a look at it, if there's a dip, if there's a dive, he's just going to be scratched and it's going to be on to the next one. And, all things considered, are you in the good graces of your head coach? Spencer Carberry liked him. He kept him around as the 13th forward. But Frank has got to pop. We need to see more. He's got to find a role, maybe even some PK time or something else. Younger might jump him on the depth chart. And it's a real thing, and it's funny, when we talk about hockey players, 27 years old, like, you better get it together. That's what it's like in pro sports, that, you need to crush it because there's even younger, in some cases, better talent than you. And, you're not picking players for your roster because they're nice guys or nice vibes. You want the best player out on the ice that's going to give you the best shot at winning a game. Period. End of sentence. There is no more. So that is what, Ethen Frank has got to do. I think he can do it, but he's going to have to impress, and he's going to have to show consistency in the preseason games, at camp, really jump out. I'm really pulling for Ethen Frank at the end of the day. Limited spots. Is he up for the challenge? Well, that is up to him. All right. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week, available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.